Marissa Rourke had barely touched the gate lock when 3 security guards seized her. One ripped the phone from her hand. 2 others twisted her arms back and slammed her face against the cold iron bars of her own gate. Lenora Whitcomb, president of the Homeowners Association, stood watching calm and smug, announcing the road now belonged to the community. Marissa gasped that her husband would be home any minute. Lenora only laughed. Then an engine roared down the gravel road. A truck skidded to a stop. A man stepped out, saw his wife pinned against the gate, and nobody there knew he had once been a United States Navy SEAL. 3 weeks earlier, none of this seemed possible. Caleb Rourke and his wife Marissa lived on a 30-acre property at the edge of a gated community called Briarcrest Estates, a development that had been built nearly 20 years after their house was already standing. A stone-paved road ran from the county highway straight through their land, and along the western edge of the neighborhood, a road that had always belonged entirely to the Rourke family, recorded on every deed since the property was first surveyed. The Homeowners Association had never held a single legal right to use it, not one line in any filing, not one easement, nothing. Lenora Whitcomb had just been re-elected president of that association, and she arrived in office with a plan worth several $1,000,000, a new clubhouse, an outdoor event space, and an expanded parking lot at the far end of the community. There was only one problem. The approved entrance to the project was too narrow for heavy construction trucks, and if she could route those trucks through the Rourke property instead, the association would save hundreds of thousands of dollars. It would otherwise have to spend building a proper access road from scratch. Lenora began politely enough with a letter offering to purchase what she called temporary access rights. Caleb declined. He explained calmly and in writing that the road surface was not rated for heavy trucks, and that a water line ran directly beneath it, a line that could easily rupture under the weight of repeated construction traffic. Lenora did not accept the explanation. A week later, a new notice arrived at the Rourke mailbox, this one declaring the road a shared community access route, language that had no basis in any county record. Marissa, who worked as a land use consultant and understood zoning maps and property law better than most attorneys, pulled the original filings and confirmed within an hour that the claim was entirely fabricated. Caleb stayed quiet through all of it, telling his wife they would handle this with paperwork, not arguments. And when she asked why, he never seemed rattled by any of it. He simply told her that people who like to threaten others were usually counting on the other person losing composure first. It was the first small hint of something in his past that Marissa had never fully asked about. Lenora escalated anyway. A sign reading authorized community access appeared beside the Rourke gate without permission. Caleb took it down. It reappeared the next morning. He took it down again, and the day after that, Lenora sent a private security team to patrol the edge of the property led by a man named Derek Voss, who introduced himself with the title of security commander, a title he had given himself. Derek told Caleb they were simply enforcing association policy, and Caleb answered that association policy ended precisely where his property line began. Derek laughed and said they would see about that. A few evenings later, Marissa found an orange survey stake driven more than 18 feet into their land, well past any boundary the county had ever recognized, and it was clear that someone was quietly trying to redraw the line between what belonged to the Rourke family and what did not. Owen Maddox himself would later admit that this quiet phase of the conflict, the weeks before anyone raised a hand, was in some ways the most dangerous of all, because it gave Lenora time to convince herself that she was the reasonable party in a dispute she alone had created. She began describing Caleb to other board members as difficult and uncooperative, a man standing in the way of progress for the entire community. And few of them thought to ask why a private family road had suddenly become community property in the first place. Some neighbors, hearing only Lenora's version of events, started giving Caleb and Marissa uneasy looks at the mailbox cluster near the highway, and one even asked Marissa directly why they were being so difficult about a simple community improvement. Marissa answered every question, patiently explaining the deed, the survey, the water line beneath the road. But she quickly learned that facts rarely traveled as fast or as far as rumors did. Marissa began building a case of her own. She pulled the county land records, the original deed transfer from 1998, and every easement filing on record, and none of them showed any right of passage for the Homeowners Association, not even a partial or contested one. She sent the full packet to Lenora, expecting a retreat. Instead, she received an invoice for $8,500, citing what the letter called obstruction of community infrastructure access, an accusation with no legal footing whatsoever, since the Rourke property had never been part of the association in the first place. Caleb laughed when he read it. Marissa did not find it funny at all because Lenora clearly knew the association had no authority to fine them and was betting that enough paperwork and enough pressure would eventually make the family give in out of exhaustion rather than principle. Then the pressure turned physical. A gravel truck attempted to drive straight through the gate one afternoon, and when Marissa blocked it, the driver produced a map he said had come from the association, proving this was public access. Caleb examined the map and noticed almost immediately that the county seal stamped across the top had been copied and pasted from an unrelated document, a crude forgery that would not survive a single phone call. He made that call. Miles Corbett, the county land engineer, confirmed within minutes that his office had never approved or issued anything resembling that document, and he agreed to send written confirmation the same day. Caleb began keeping a file of his own quietly and methodically, gathering camera footage, letters, the false invoice, the forged map, and a running log of every trespass. And Marissa realized her husband was assembling evidence with the discipline of someone who had done this kind of work before. When she asked how many times he had built a case like this in his life, he only told her that evidence was always more reliable than anger. Lenora, meanwhile, kept pushing, sending Derek and his team to stand near the gate every day, under the claim that they were staying strictly on association land. Though the camera footage told a different story, each time one of them stepped over the line without hesitation. The guards Lenora hired were not local police, not licensed peace officers of any kind, only private contractors paid by the association to patrol a boundary they did not fully understand and were not legally entitled to enforce. Derek liked to remind people that his company had handled security for shopping centers and corporate campuses for over a decade, as if that history gave him some authority over a private residential road, and Caleb never bothered correcting him, choosing instead to let the cameras and the county records speak for themselves when the time eventually came. Marissa noticed that the guards grew bolder each week, parking closer to the gate, walking the tree line at odd hours, even shining flashlights toward the house late at night under the excuse of routine patrol. She began keeping her own log beside Caleb's noting times license plates and the exact moment each vehicle crossed onto land that was not theirs to stand on. One afternoon, Colton Price, the most aggressive of the guards, tried to pry the chain off the gate lock himself. Caleb appeared without a word, standing a few feet away, not raising his voice, not raising a hand, and something in the stillness of his expression made Colton back off immediately. Derek stepped between them and accused Caleb of threatening his employee, and Caleb answered that he was simply giving him a chance to walk off private property before the situation became something neither of them wanted. They left that day, and Lenora treated the retreat as a small victory, telling Derek privately that the man was clearly just putting on a show for effect. It was the first of many misjudgments she would make about Caleb Rourke, mistaking his restraint for fear, when in truth he was doing everything he could to avoid a confrontation he already knew he could win in seconds. The Homeowners Association picked the one day Caleb happened to be out of town, driving 2 counties over to meet an old friend from his military years, and Lenora knew this because her security team had been quietly logging the comings and goings of every vehicle on the property for weeks. She decided this was the moment to act. The plan was simple and deliberate: bring construction equipment onto the Rourke Road, remove part of the gate, lay down a base layer of gravel, and once trucks had used the road for even a few days, the association would claim what Lenora called established practical use, a phrase meant to sound like a legal principle when it was really nothing more than an attempt to seize access through brute persistence. Lenora had chosen the timing with the same cold precision she brought to everything else, waiting for a morning when the road crew's schedule, the guards' shift rotation, and Caleb's trip out of town all lined up perfectly. She told Derek this was simply establishing a pattern of use. The courts would eventually have to recognize a phrase she had picked up from a real estate seminar years earlier and repeat it as though it carried the weight of actual law. Derek, for his part, had reservations. He never voiced out loud uneasy about bringing heavy equipment onto land that was clearly posted and fenced. But the money the association paid his company was good, and good money had a way of quieting doubts that should have been louder. Marissa was working from home that morning when she heard heavy machinery outside, and when she stepped out, she found a small excavator, 2 flatbed trucks, and 4 security guards already gathered at the gate, with Derek holding a printed sheet he called an authorization. Marissa told him flatly that the association had no authority to authorize anything on this land, and moments later, Lenora arrived in her black SUV, stepping out to inform Marissa that she was obstructing a community project of significant public value. Marissa lifted her phone to record the scene, ordering all of them off the property immediately, and Derek signaled for the crew to keep working anyway. She planted herself directly in front of the gate and told them plainly that no one was opening it, and that was when Lenora's tone shifted from bureaucratic to cold, turning to Derek and telling him to handle her. Derek hesitated for a moment, but Colton did not. He lunged forward, tore the phone from Marissa's hand, and when she reached to take it back, he seized her wrist hard enough to make her cry out, and a second guard grabbed her other arm and forced her against the iron gate, her cheek pressed to the metal while she demanded they let her go. Lenora stood only a few steps away, watching without a flicker of concern, telling Marissa she could either stand still or be held there until the sheriff arrived to sort it out. Marissa fought back with words, instead of her body telling them they were assaulting her on her own land, and Lenora corrected her coolly, insisting they were simply protecting association property. Till Larissa glanced down the road, knowing exactly whose truck would be coming around that bend before long. And she said it out loud, telling Lenora that her husband would be home any minute. Lenora only smiled and said that would be perfect, since he could learn the same lesson she was teaching his wife. It was at that exact moment the low rumble of an engine reached them from the far curve of the road, growing louder with every second, and every guard standing there turned to look. Caleb came around the bend, and the first thing he saw was not the trucks, not the excavator, not even Lenora standing off to the side. It was his wife pinned by two men against their own gate, her face pressed to iron. She had walked past 1,000 times without a second thought. He braked, cut the engine, and stepped out without a shout and without a run, because the years behind him had taught him that speed without control solved nothing. And it was that unnatural calm, more than anything else, that made Derek go quiet. Caleb asked Marissa if she was hurt, and she told him her wrist was aching and that they had taken her phone. He looked at Colton and told him to take his hands off his wife. And when Colton told him to back off instead, Caleb took one more step forward, close enough that Derek moved to block him, insisting this was an authorized association operation. Caleb looked at him without blinking and said he had about 3 seconds to decide whether he wanted to keep making this mistake. Colton, instead of releasing Marissa, tightened his grip, and that single choice became the last mistake of the confrontation. Caleb moved, and the movement was fast, controlled, and economical, with nothing wasted and nothing excessive, taking hold of Colton's wrist, turning his body, and forcing the release before bringing him to the ground with a simple joint lock that ended the threat without a single closed fist thrown. The second guard rushed in from the side, and Caleb pivoted, redirected the man's own momentum, and pinned his arm against the side of the truck bed until the fight went out of him entirely. Derek pulled a baton from his belt, and Caleb told him plainly not to. But Derek swung anyway, and Caleb caught his forearm, stripped the baton from his hand, and let it fall to the gravel at his feet. What none of the guards understood in that moment was how deliberately Caleb had chosen every motion, because years of training had taught him that the difference between a controlled outcome and a tragedy was almost always a matter of restraint rather than force. He could have ended the confrontation far more violently, and some quiet, distant part of him, the part that still remembered the sound of gunfire in places far from home, recognized exactly how much he was holding back. He did not want a courtroom later asking why a trained operator had used more force than the situation required against unarmed civilians, however reckless those civilians had been, and so every joint lock, every redirected step was calculated to end the threat and nothing more. The whole exchange lasted only a few seconds, and nobody was left unconscious. Nobody was beaten beyond what the moment required, because this was not a demonstration of strength for its own sake. It was simply skill applied with total control. Lenora stood frozen, the confidence gone from her face for the first time since the confrontation began. Derek looked at Caleb and asked who exactly he was, and Caleb answered simply that he was the man who owned this land, then turned immediately to check on his wife's wrist without another word to anyone else. Lenora fumbled for her phone and called emergency services, telling the dispatcher that a dangerous man had just attacked her security team, and Caleb did nothing to stop her. In fact, he told her calmly to make sure she asked for the sheriff by name, a request that sounded almost like a taunt but was in truth exactly the outcome he wanted. While they waited, Derek began to notice something about the man standing across from him, a stillness that did not match anything he had seen in years of private security work. He asked Caleb if he had served in the military, and Caleb said nothing at all. One of the other guards caught sight of a small tattoo near Caleb's wrist, a symbol he recognized from his own years in the Navy, and he whispered to Derek that this man had trained in naval special warfare. Derek turned back to Caleb and asked outright if he had been a SEAL, and though Caleb never confirmed it in words, the look on his face told the guards everything they needed to know, and the fear that spread through the group in that instant had nothing to do with the fight that had just ended, and everything to do with the one they now understood they had barely avoided. Marissa sat on the tailgate of Caleb's truck while they waited, holding an ice pack. Caleb had pulled from the cab against her wrist, and she watched her husband move through the aftermath with the same unnerving calm he had shown throughout the entire fight. He checked on the guard he had pinned against the truck bed, made sure the man could breathe properly and had not struck his head, and told him flatly that none of this needed to have happened. The guard, still shaken, only nodded and said nothing, glancing nervously toward Colton, who lay groaning on the gravel a few feet away, cradling the wrist Caleb had locked only moments earlier. Lenora paced near her SUV, phone pressed to her ear, rehearsing the story she intended to tell before anyone else arrived to hear it. 3 sheriff's vehicles arrived within minutes, and Lenora rushed toward them before anyone else could speak, ready to tell her version first, that Caleb had attacked her security personnel, that the association was simply enforcing its rightful access, that Marissa had obstructed lawful work. Sheriff Owen Maddox stepped out of the last car, and the moment his eyes landed on Caleb, something passed between the two men that needed no introduction. Owen did not use a rank or a title from the past. He simply asked what had happened here, and Lenora, startled, asked if he actually knew this man. Owen said he did nothing more, and turned his attention to the footage Caleb had already pulled from the camera mounted above the gate. The recording left no room for interpretation. It showed Marissa standing in front of the gate, Colton tearing the phone from her hands, 2 guards forcing her against the iron bars, and Lenora standing calmly nearby, giving the order to hold her there. Owen turned to Derek and asked whether they had any warrant authorizing entry onto the property, and Derek admitted they did not. He asked if there was any court order permitting access, and again, the answer was no. He asked if there was any easement on record with the county, and this time Lenora tried to interject, insisting the association's attorney had confirmed their rights. But Owen cut her off and asked specifically for documentation filed with the county, not a verbal assurance from a lawyer. Nobody answered. Colton was placed in handcuffs for assault. The second guard was detained as well, and Derek was ordered to surrender his baton and his private security credentials on the spot. Lenora, sensing the ground shifting beneath her, turned and pointed straight at Caleb, insisting he had attacked her men without provocation. Owen watched the footage again before answering that Caleb had used force to end an assault that was actively taking place against his wife, nothing more and nothing less. Lenora shouted that the man was dangerous, and Owen looked at her evenly and told her she had no idea who she was actually speaking to. Caleb gave him a small, quiet look, one that asked him not to say anything further, and Owen understood immediately, though it was already too late, because Derek had heard enough to ask one of the deputies quietly whether the rumor about Caleb being a former SEAL was true, and the deputy answered that was what he had heard as well. For the first time, Lenora began to understand that the man she had provoked was not the easy target she had assumed, though revenge was still the furthest thing from Caleb's mind. All he asked Owen for was a formal complaint on record, and every piece of construction equipment removed from his property before nightfall, and Owen agreed without hesitation, watching as Lenora's multi-million-dollar project was pushed back down the road it had never had permission to use in Factovarks. The first place, though, this confrontation, as painful as it had been, was only the beginning of what would eventually unravel around her. By the time the deputies finished processing the scene, the construction equipment sat abandoned along the edge of the road engines, silent operators standing beside their trucks with nothing to do but wait for someone to tell them where to go. Owen personally supervised as each vehicle backed off the Rourke property, making sure the excavator's tracks had not damaged the water line Caleb had warned about from the very beginning. He told Caleb quietly away from the others that he had heard rumors about a rough situation years ago involving a special operations team and a hostage extraction overseas, and Caleb only looked at him and said that was a conversation for another day, if ever. Owen respected that answer completely and let it go, filing his report using nothing more than what the cameras and the witnesses could confirm. Marissa's wrist was examined that evening and showed no serious injury, only a deep bruise that would take weeks to fade, and Caleb felt an anger in that moment sharper than almost anything he had carried through. Years of far more dangerous work, because watching his wife pinned against their own gate reach somewhere, his training had never fully prepared him to defend. Marissa told him not to let Lenora turn him into the story she wanted to tell, and Caleb understood exactly what she meant, because if he answered violence with more violence, Lenora would have every excuse she needed to recast herself as the victim. So instead of retaliation, he and Marissa turned towards something far more effective, gathering every scrap of documentation they could find and pulling in Miles Corbett to provide the original county survey once again, which was when they uncovered something even larger than the road dispute itself. Not only did the association have no legal claim to the Rourke property, but a portion of the new clubhouse design encroached directly onto a county drainage easement, a fact Lenora clearly knew and had chosen to ignore. Worse still, the forged map used to justify sending construction trucks through private land carried what appeared to be Miles Corbett's own digital signature, copied without his knowledge or consent. Miles confirmed flatly that he had never signed any such document in his life. And that single detail transformed the entire situation from a property dispute into something closer to outright fraud. Caleb requested a review of the metadata attached to every file the construction crew had received, and the trail led directly back to a computer inside the Homeowners Association office itself, leaving no ambiguity about where the forged documents had originated. Marissa uncovered something even more damning while reviewing public financial filings. Lenora had used the same fraudulent map to secure a construction loan worth $3,600,000, presenting the bank with false assurance that the association already had direct, unrestricted access to the clubhouse site. If that access had never legally existed, the loan application itself was now built on a foundation of misrepresented facts, serious enough to draw the attention of state regulators. Nora Bellamy, the association's own attorney, began to panic once she understood the scope of what had happened, and she reached out to Marissa privately to say that Lenora had never shown her this particular version of the map, only an earlier draft discussing negotiated easement rights, nothing resembling a claim of forced access. Marissa asked what Nora had actually advised the board, and Nora answered that her guidance had only ever covered the right to negotiate, never the right to seize. It was in that quiet conversation that Nora realized her own name and credentials had been used to lend legitimacy to a plan she had never actually approved, and from that moment forward, the structure Lenora had built around herself began to crack from the inside out. In the days that followed, Caleb and Marissa worked almost like a two-person investigative team, dividing the labor according to their strengths, with Marissa handling the paper trail of deeds, easements, and financial filings, while Caleb focused on timelines, photographs, and the chain of custody for every piece of digital evidence they collected. He printed everything twice and stored one copy off-site with a friend from his old unit, a habit left over from years of operations where losing evidence could cost more than just a legal case. Marissa admired the thoroughness of it, telling him one evening that he built a file the way most people built a house, one careful layer at a time. And Caleb told her that sloppy preparation was the fastest way to lose a fight before it even started. Miles Corbett proved to be an unexpectedly powerful ally, more than willing to testify that his signature had been used without his knowledge. Since the forgery itself was a professional embarrassment, he had no intention of quietly absorbing. Word of what had happened at the gate spread quickly through Briarcrest Estates, and Lenora, sensing the tide turning against her, called an emergency meeting of the entire community, determined to seize control of the narrative before anyone else could. Her strategy was simple: paint Caleb as the dangerous one. Standing in front of a packed room, she told the residents that Mr. Rourke was a trained combat veteran who had physically assaulted her security team without provocation, and a wave of uneasy murmurs moved through the crowd as she spoke. Caleb and Marissa walked in together, and Caleb wore nothing but a plain button-down shirt, no uniform, no medals, nothing to suggest the years he had spent in service. Lenora turned to him directly and asked if he would admit in front of everyone that he had once been a Navy SEAL, and Caleb answered simply that he had. The room fell completely silent. Lenora pressed further, saying that meant he had been trained to cause serious harm to another human being, and Caleb answered that he had actually been trained to control dangerous situations using the least amount of force necessary to end them safely. Marissa then stepped forward and played the gate footage for the entire room, and every resident watched in real time as two guards forced her against the iron bars while Lenora stood by giving orders. Gasps and angry murmurs spread through the crowd, and when Lenora tried to have the video stopped, Marissa simply continued moving next to the original county survey, showing no association claim to the road whatsoever, followed by the forged map bearing Miles Corbett's stolen signature, and, finally, an email in which Lenora had instructed the construction crew to use the western access regardless of the Rourke family's objections. The room grew louder with every new document Marissa displayed, and several residents who had donated money toward the clubhouse fund began exchanging worried glances, realizing for the first time that their contributions had been resting on claims that were never true. One elderly resident, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Bennett, who had lived in Briarcrest since it was first developed, stood and asked why the board had never simply shown the community the actual survey before pushing the project forward. Lenora tried to answer that the survey had been under review, but Nora Bellamy, still standing near the back of the room, interrupted to say there had never been any survey under review at all, only the one Miles Corbett had provided from the beginning, the one that clearly excluded the Rourke Road from any association claim. A resident stood up and asked Lenora point-blank whether she had known about their objection the entire time, and another asked if she had known all along that the road did not legally belong to the association. Lenora's composure began to collapse in real time as the questions piled on top of one another, and then Nora Bellamy rose from her seat near the back of the room. The association's own attorney announced clearly for everyone to hear that her office had never advised the board that it possessed any right to force access across the Rourke property under any circumstance. It was a devastating blow because Lenora could no longer claim she had simply been following legal counsel, and by the time the meeting ended, what had begun as an attempt to discredit Caleb had turned into an open uprising against the woman who had orchestrated the entire scheme from the start. The board voted that same night to open a formal internal review, and within 48 hours the local news had picked up a shortened version of the story, focused mostly on the viral video of a homeowner being restrained at her own gate, rather than the deeper financial questions still waiting to surface. Lenora refused every interview request, retreating instead to her attorney's office to plan her next move, still convinced that with the right framing she could survive the fallout and keep her position on the board. She was not yet aware of how much more damaging information was still sitting quietly in Marissa's growing file, waiting for the right moment to be released. Even with all of this laid bare, Caleb still felt something did not fully add up, because Lenora had taken an enormous risk for what seemed on the surface like nothing more than the cost of a construction access road. Marissa dug deeper into public financial records and found that the general contractor hired for the clubhouse project was owned by a holding company, and the ultimate beneficiary of that company was Lenora's own brother. The contract itself was worth more than $5 million, and Lenora had pushed the project through the board while inflating the projected costs well beyond reasonable market rates. If the Rourke Road could be used free of charge, the profit margin for her family's construction business would climb substantially higher than if the association had to build a proper access route on its own. This was no longer simply a dispute about association authority. It was a scheme built entirely around personal financial gain, hidden behind the language of community improvement. Nora Bellamy, now fully cooperating, turned over a series of internal emails to an independent attorney brought in to review the situation, and one message in particular stood out immediately, in which Lenora had written that once access was established, Rourke would never be able to reverse it without years of costly litigation. Another email, sent only days before the confrontation at the gate, instructed the security team directly that if his wife interfered, they were authorized to remove her by force. That single line changed everything, because it proved beyond doubt that what happened to Marissa had never been some spontaneous overreaction by an aggressive guard, but a scenario Lenora had anticipated and explicitly approved. Advance. Caleb read that email several times in complete silence. He felt the old instinct rise in him, the same one that had once guided him through situations far more dangerous than a corrupt homeowners association, but he pushed it down and let it settle. Marissa told him gently that he did not need to become the version of himself he had left behind years ago, and Caleb agreed, telling her that this time they would let the system do the work, instead of doing it themselves. Nora Bellamy, once she understood the full scope of what she had unknowingly helped enable, made the difficult decision to formally withdraw her firm from any further representation of the association, a move that effectively left Lenora without legal cover just as the investigation began accelerating. She met privately with Marissa one final time, apologizing for how easily her name and credentials had been used to lend false legitimacy to a scheme she had never actually approved. And Marissa told her the most useful thing she could do now was make sure investigators saw every email exactly as it had been written without omission or softening. Nora agreed, and within days the county prosecutor's office had a file thick enough to support charges well beyond a simple property dispute. Sheriff Owen forwarded the full evidence file to the county prosecutor's office, and the bank that had issued the construction loan quietly opened its own internal fraud investigation soon after. The association board voted to suspend Lenora from her position pending review, though she was far from ready to accept defeat. The night before the board's final vote to remove her permanently, the cameras at the Rourke property picked up a black SUV idling near the gate. Derek Voss stepped out alone, unarmed, and Caleb walked out to meet him without hesitation. Derek told him plainly that he had not come looking for trouble. He admitted that Lenora had personally ordered him to delete the internal footage recorded by his team's body cameras during the confrontation, and that he had refused, only for her to threaten to place the entire blame for what happened squarely on his shoulders instead. He handed Caleb a small flash drive containing that very footage video that captured the confrontation in far more damning detail than anything shown at the community meeting, including a moment where Lenora could be heard clearly, instructing the guards to hold her there until the trucks were through. Caleb asked why he was choosing to bring this forward now, and Derek answered honestly that he had done something foolish that day, but he was not willing to spend years in prison protecting a woman who had never once intended to protect him. In return, the following morning, Lenora arrived at the association office, still convinced she could somehow salvage her position, and she began quietly gathering documents from her desk, unaware that Sheriff Owen had already secured a warrant based on everything Derek and Nora had provided. Owen walked in with 2 deputies close behind, and Caleb chose not to take part in the arrest itself, standing outside instead beside Marissa, watching quietly as it unfolded. As deputies led Lenora out of the building in handcuffs, she caught sight of the 2 of them standing there and screamed that Caleb had done this to her. He answered simply that she had done it to herself. And in that single exchange, the balance of power that had defined their entire conflict shifted completely and permanently. Caleb chose not to attend Lenora's arraignment, telling Marissa he had already gotten everything he needed. The day the deputies led her out of the association office in handcuffs, and that watching the rest play out in a courtroom would not change anything for either of them. Marissa went once quietly sitting near the back where Lenora would not easily see her, and she left before the hearing even finished, satisfied simply to know the process was finally moving the way it should have from the very beginning. The investigation that followed produced consequences that reached far beyond the gate where it had all begun. Lenora was formally charged with document forgery, financial fraud connected to the construction loan, directing an unlawful trespass onto private property conspiracy, involving falsified county records, and her direct role in the physical assault against Marissa. Colton lost his security license entirely and faced separate criminal charges for the assault itself, while Derek, having cooperated fully with investigators, received a far lighter sentence than he otherwise would have. The Homeowners Association was forced to cancel the clubhouse project in its original form, and the construction loan was frozen indefinitely once the bank confirmed the extent of the misrepresentation used to secure it. The contracting company owned by Lenora's brother lost the deal entirely, and within weeks, the residents of Briarcrest Estates voted overwhelmingly to remove every member of the board closely tied to her from their positions. Colton, for his part, tried to argue at his hearing that he had simply been following orders from his supervisor, an argument the judge dismissed quickly once the body cam footage Derek provided was entered into evidence, showing clearly that no reasonable person could have mistaken restraining a homeowner at her own gate for lawful security work. He ultimately pleaded to a lesser charge in exchange for a short sentence and a permanent bar from holding any security license in the state again. Derek's cooperation earned him probation rather than jail time, though the damage to his company's reputation proved far more lasting than any court-ordered penalty, with 3 of his largest remaining clients quietly ending their contracts within the month. Lenora's brother, whose construction company had been set to profit most from the entire scheme, found himself the subject of a separate civil suit filed by several association members who wanted every dollar of inflated billing returned to the community fund. A new board was elected soon after, and one of its very first actions was drafting a formal letter of apology to Caleb and Marissa, along with a commitment to cover every legal expense the family had incurred throughout the entire ordeal. Caleb asked for only one additional thing in return. He wanted a proper fence, built exactly along the boundary line the county had already confirmed. Nothing more elaborate than that: no side gates, no misleading signage, no vague language about shared community access, simply an honest line, marking exactly where his property began and where it ended. Harold Bennett, the retired schoolteacher who had spoken up at the community meeting, was elected the new board president in a vote that carried almost unanimous support, and one of his first public statements promised a full audit of every contract the previous board had signed over the last 3 years. He personally visited Caleb and Marissa to deliver the new board's letter of apology in person rather than by mail, telling them the community owed them more than paperwork could ever repay, and Caleb accepted the gesture graciously, though he made clear that all he had ever wanted was for people to respect a boundary that had never been theirs to cross. Weeks later, Caleb and Marissa stood together in front of the newly finished gate, and Marissa ran her fingers lightly over a faint scratch, still visible on the old iron bars. A small reminder of the afternoon she had been pinned against. Them. She asked Caleb whether he had ever considered telling people from the very beginning what he had once done in the Navy, and he shook his head, telling her that respect earned only through fear of someone's past was never truly respect. At all. Marissa laughed and admitted that the look on their faces the moment they finally understood had still been worth seeing. Caleb smiled too, the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to loosen in his chest. In the distance, workers were removing the last of the old association signs that had once claimed authority over land that was never theirs to claim. The clubhouse Lenora had promised her community was never built. The road remained exactly where it had always been, quiet, private, and entirely theirs. And what Lenora ultimately learned far too late to change anything was that she had never truly seen a dangerous man standing at that gate. She had only ever seen a patient one, and she had mistaken his patience for weakness until the very last moment it cost her everything she had built.